It was a quiet spring morning in Maple Ridge, Tennessee, the kind of Sunday that felt the same for generations. The sun rose over the Pine Ridge behind the First Baptist Church, spilling soft light across whitewashed siding and gravel parking lots lined with pickup trucks. Birds sang from the telephone wires, and the smell of blooming dogwood hung in the air. Inside, families filled the pews, handshakes, hymnals, the shuffle of Sunday shoes. Among them sat the Walker family, Mark, his wife Ellen, and their 5-year-old daughter, Hannah. She was a bright, restless child, golden curls, blue eyes too curious for her age, dressed in a pale yellow dress and holding a small picture Bible, the one she insisted on carrying herself. The service that morning ran long. Pastor Wilkins spoke about faith and patience, about how small moments test a believer's strength. Ellen remembered later how Hannah had leaned against her side, humming quietly, impatient to get outside. When the final hymn ended, the congregation spilled into the warm air, laughing and talking in clusters. Children ran between cars, and the church bells began their steady, peaceful chime. Ellen stayed behind for just a moment, speaking to the choir director about the upcoming Easter play. Mark, she thought, had already taken Hannah outside. When she finally stepped through the church doors, the lot was nearly emptying. She expected to see her daughter waiting by their car, the old tan sedan parked near the edge of the gravel. But Hannah wasn't there. At first, it was nothing unusual. Ellen scanned the nearby steps, calling lightly, "Hannah?" She thought maybe her daughter had gone to find her father near the fellowship hall or to pick one of the wildflowers she loved from the grassy ditch near the road. A few minutes passed, then 5, then 10. When Mark came around the corner holding a paper cup of coffee, Ellen's voice carried something new in it, confusion turning to fear. "Where's Hannah?" she asked. He froze. "I thought she was with you." That sentence, those 6 words, became the moment everything began to unravel. By the time the church realized what was happening, panic had already set in. People scattered across the lot, calling Hannah's name. Older women checked bathrooms and hallways. Deacons searched behind the church where the woods thickened toward the creek. Someone ran down to the road. Another shouted to lock the doors. It took less than 15 minutes for the sheriff's office to arrive. Deputies placed yellow tape across the parking lot as disbelief rippled through the crowd. No one wanted to imagine something truly wrong, not here, not in their quiet town. Witnesses were questioned right there on the gravel. Most had seen nothing except the usual traffic leaving after the service. But one man, an elderly church member named Earl Simmons, said he noticed a blue pickup truck pulling out fast from behind the side building, maybe 20 minutes before the panic began. He didn't think much of it at the time, but something about it felt odd. The plate wasn't local white letters on a dark background, from a neighboring county maybe. As the hours passed, the tone shifted from confusion to dread. A search perimeter was established within 2 miles of the church. Volunteers lined up with flashlights, combing through nearby woods and drainage ditches. The sound of people calling Hannah's name carried deep into the trees, fading into the echo of church bells, still tolling from the tower, a cruel reminder of how ordinary the day had started. By mid-afternoon, K-9 units were brought in. The dogs picked up a faint scent near the edge of the lot, a path leading toward the back road that connected to Highway 12, but it ended abruptly by the old fence line. No footprints, no tire marks deep enough to trace. Just the smell of pine needles and gasoline drifting from somewhere unseen. Reporters arrived before sunset, their vans parked beside the command post. The Walkers gave short, trembling statements, voices raw from shouting her name all day. Ellen could barely stand. Someone handed her a blanket she didn't remember taking. Her face was pale, eyes fixed on the edge of the woods as if Hannah might walk out at any moment, dirt on her knees, smiling like it was all a game. But the sun dropped behind the trees, and Hannah did not come home. That night, floodlights turned the churchyard into an eerie stage, officers marking grids, volunteers whispering, prayers rising under their breath. Neighbors brought sandwiches, coffee, and blankets, but few could eat. The sheriff announced they'd continue through the night. Every window in town glowed blue from TV screens replaying the same photo, Hannah's school picture. Her smile too big for her face, a missing child alert in bold letters beneath it. By midnight, state police were called in. The investigation officially crossed county lines, which meant more manpower, more dogs, and eventually, the FBI. But even then, every new hour felt heavier than the last. Hope was still there, but thin, fragile, stretched by exhaustion and disbelief. Ellen and Mark stayed at the church until dawn. A deputy suggested they rest, but Ellen refused. She kept walking to the parking lot, staring at the same patch of gravel where her daughter was last seen, whispering her name like it might summon her back. When morning broke, dew covered the cars, still parked in the lot. Volunteers shuffled home for showers and sleep, and the next group took over. The town was now on edge, every stranger eyed with suspicion, every sound a possible clue. Days turned into a week. The blue truck became the focus, but no one could find it. There were hundreds like it across Tennessee. Posters went up at gas stations, grocery stores, and along the highways, Hannah's face smiling from every telephone pole. People who had known the Walkers their entire lives couldn't look them in the eye without breaking. The church bells stayed silent after that Sunday. Pastor Wilkins said he couldn't bear the sound anymore. What began as a single morning had split the town in two before Hannah vanished, and after. And as the second week closed with no answers, the quiet faith of Maple Ridge began to crack. Because deep down, everyone feared the same thing. Whatever had happened to that little girl hadn't come from far away. It had happened right there among them. That realization settled like a shadow over every pew, every prayer, every sleepless night that followed. The morning after Hannah's disappearance, Maple Ridge transformed from a peaceful town into a place swallowed by panic. The sheriff's office set up a command post inside the church fellowship hall, tables covered in maps, coffee-stained notepads, and missing child flyers hot off the copier. The air smelled of ink and desperation. By midday, helicopters hovered over the pine forest behind the church, their blades chopping through the stillness. Search teams spread out in long, uneven lines through fields and creek beds, marking their progress with colored tape. They called her name again and again, Hannah, Hannah Walker. But the woods stayed silent except for the wind moving through branches. Search dogs were brought in from Nashville. For a few fleeting hours, they gave everyone hope. The bloodhounds caught a faint scent trail from the church lot down a narrow service road that wound between two hills. Officers followed for nearly a mile until the scent stopped cold. No footprints, no fibers, no tire impressions that could hold up in court. It was as if the little girl had stepped off the earth. For the first 48 hours, the town moved as one heartbeat, volunteers filling the woods, people donating sandwiches, flashlights, and fuel. But as the third day arrived, exhaustion and doubt began to take root. Detectives started narrowing their focus, looking closer at the people who were at the church that morning. Every face from that service was written down. One name kept resurfacing: Dale Mercer. He was the church's maintenance worker, a man in his late 40s, quiet, polite, never caused trouble. He'd been there that morning, sweeping the steps and collecting hymnals after the service. Several members remembered seeing him near the parking lot shortly before Hannah vanished. He lived alone, 2 miles from the church, in a small white trailer tucked behind a cornfield. Investigators brought him in for questioning. Mercer didn't seem nervous, only confused. He said he left shortly after the service ended, went home to mow his yard, and didn't hear about the missing girl until that evening. His story checked out. A neighbor confirmed seeing him on his lawn. A search of his trailer turned up nothing but tools, church supplies, and a stack of old maintenance logs. Still, detectives couldn't shake their unease. He was a man with keys to every door in the church, including the basement and storage areas no one else ever used. When the sheriff asked why he was seen lingering in the parking lot after most people had left, Mercer said he was locking the side door. It sounded harmless, but it was enough to plant a seed of suspicion that never really went away. Within days, the story had spread beyond Maple Ridge. News vans lined the 2-lane road leading into town. The church parking lot, once a place of peace, became the backdrop for live broadcasts filled with speculation. People began locking their doors for the first time in years. Strangers were questioned if they lingered too long near a playground. Every blue pickup truck that drove through town drew a second look. 3 weeks after Hannah disappeared, the FBI joined the case, offering forensic support and behavioral profiling. They analyzed the timeline, the witness statements, and the physical layout of the church property. Their conclusion: The abduction likely happened fast within 90 seconds, suggesting the perpetrator was familiar with the area and confident enough to act in broad daylight. That ruled out a random passerby. Whoever took Hannah had probably been there before. That finding reignited attention on Dale Mercer. He was brought back for a second interview, this time with federal agents in the room. He didn't crack. No inconsistencies. No signs of deceit. Just the same soft-spoken denials and weary eyes. Polygraphs were inconclusive. Without evidence, no vehicle match, no fibers, no fingerprints. They couldn't hold him. And so the case began to fracture. Some locals believed Mercer did it, that he'd buried her somewhere in those woods. Others whispered about Drifters, the hitchhiker seen 2 towns over, the stranger who stopped at the gas station asking for directions that same morning. Conspiracy theories flourished in the absence of truth. A few even claimed it was an inside job, that someone from the church itself was protecting the guilty. The Walkers tried to stay strong. Mark worked with volunteers daily, while Ellen attended every briefing, every prayer circle, refusing to leave town until her daughter was found. But after months of dead ends, fatigue broke them. Each new day became harder to bear than the last. When autumn came, the leaves turned red and gold, and the posters that had once been bright white began to fade and curl along the edges. Hannah's face, that little half-smile, blurred under the Tennessee sun. By winter, the search team stopped gathering. Funding dried up. Tips slowed to nothing. What remained was silence, a kind that sank into every conversation and every corner of the community. The Walkers moved to Knoxville after Christmas. Ellen couldn't stand driving past the church anymore. She said it felt like the building was watching her, reminding her of the moment she let Hannah out of her sight. Without the Walkers, the church never recovered. Attendance dropped. Choir rehearsals grew sparse. People stopped lingering after services. They left quietly, eyes down. Pastor Wilkins confessed in later years that he'd often pause mid-sermon, waiting for the sound of a child's voice, half expecting Hannah's laughter to drift from the hall the way it used to. Rumors about Dale Mercer never went away. He stayed in town, keeping mostly to himself. His presence became a reminder, a living question mark that haunted every conversation. Some people said they saw him sitting in the churchyard late at night, staring at the building. Others claimed he'd confessed under his breath at a diner once, though no one could prove it. Time moved on, but Maple Ridge didn't heal. The churchyard grass grew long that next spring, left untrimmed because no one wanted to work there. Parents kept their kids within arm's reach. The town's annual fair was canceled that year. Too many people said it didn't feel right to celebrate. By the second anniversary, only a handful of volunteers still met monthly to revisit old leads. One of them was Deputy Caldwell, who'd been a rookie during the initial search. He later said he never forgot the sound of the mother's screams echoing through those woods. It became the measure of everything he'd do after the reason he stayed in law enforcement for nearly 3 decades. Maple Ridge was no longer the same town. It existed in 2 eras now, before Hannah disappeared, and after. What once had been a community rooted in faith became one built around fear and quiet resentment. Even the sermons changed. Each week, Pastor Wilkins spoke of forgiveness, but his voice would tremble when he mentioned it. The case file stayed open, stacked on the sheriff's shelf between others, just like it, thick with statements, empty of answers. And beneath all the noise, the same question echoed in every mind. If the man they all suspected wasn't guilty, then who was? That question would linger for nearly 3 decades unanswered, growing colder with every passing year, until the day someone opened that basement wall. By 2005, the white church on Pine Hollow Road was barely standing. Its paint had peeled to gray, its steeple leaned slightly to one side, and the congregation that once filled its pews had long scattered. A new pastor named Reverend Markley had recently taken ownership through a small Christian fellowship group, hoping to restore the property and breathe life back into it. But the town around it, older, quieter now, hadn't forgotten. People still called it the place where that little girl disappeared. Some crossed the road rather than walk past. Others said the ground there never felt right again. The renovations began in late spring. Workers stripped paint, replaced rotted boards, and cleared out decades of clutter from the Sunday school wing. For a while, it was just ordinary labor dust, hammers, laughter echoing in empty rooms. But then came the complaints. The pastor told one of the contractors about a smell rising from the basement whenever the air turned humid. Faint, sour, like mildew or something older. He also mentioned the floor in one corner had started to sink slightly, as if the ground beneath was hollow. The crew assumed it was structural rot. The building was, after all, nearly a century old. They pried open the wood planks to expose the concrete foundation, but what they found didn't match any blueprint. Behind a thin layer of crumbling plaster and a set of uneven bricks was a wall newer than the rest of the structure, sealed tightly with mortar that looked different in color and texture. It wasn't part of the original church design. At first, they thought it might be an old repair, maybe a storage alcove someone had filled in decades earlier. But when they knocked on it, the sound was wrong, hollow, muffled, as if there was space behind it. The pastor gave permission to break through, curious more than afraid. They chipped at the bricks for nearly an hour until the last one cracked loose, revealing an opening no wider than a crawlspace. Cold air spilled out from the darkness beyond, mixed with the faint metallic odor of soil that hadn't seen daylight in years. One of the men shined a flashlight inside. Dust drifted like fog through the beam. What they saw made them all step back. Inside that crawlspace lay the scattered remains of small belongings, a single child's shoe with faded yellow stitching, scraps of what looked like a dress hem embedded in the dirt, and a plastic bracelet, still looped in a perfect circle as if it had just been taken off. Nothing else at first glance, just these small, forgotten things buried beneath the church floor. The men didn't touch anything. They called the sheriff immediately. By the time investigators arrived, the building was swarming with officers, crime scene technicians, and camera crews. Yellow tape once again crossed the same gravel lot where Hannah Walker's name had been shouted 28 years earlier. For many in Maple Ridge, it was a sight they thought they'd never see again. The discovery reignited the wound that had never really closed. Some residents came to watch from across the road, holding onto fence posts or leaning on car hoods in silence. Reporters returned, asking the same old questions, their microphones trembling in the wind. Inside the church basement, the investigators carefully removed debris layer by layer. Every object found was catalogued, photographed, and sealed in evidence bags. Among the fragments was a piece of fabric with tiny embroidered flowers, the same pattern Ellen Walker had described on the dress her daughter wore the morning she vanished. Another item, a plastic charm from a children's bracelet, matched one shown in the original case file photos. Each new discovery chipped away at what little denial the town had left. DNA specialists were brought in to examine the soil and bone fragments collected from the crawlspace. The area was treated as an active crime scene, every corner of the church mapped and scanned. It became clear that the wall sealing the crawlspace had been added sometime after the original construction, bricks newer, mortar fresher. Whoever built it had done so deliberately, not for maintenance but to hide something. When word reached Ellen and Mark Walker, who had been living quietly near Knoxville for years, Ellen collapsed. For almost 3 decades she'd prayed for a sign, any sign, that her daughter was still out there. Now the sign had come, but in the worst possible form. For weeks, investigators worked through the church, uncovering more small traces, fragments of cloth fibers, a few strands of hair preserved in the dust. Forensic teams compared them to samples from the Walker family's old DNA submissions, still stored in federal databases. It took several months for results to come back, but the conclusion was undeniable. The remains belonged to Hannah Walker. When the news was made public, Maple Ridge fell into stunned quiet. The same church that had once gathered to pray for the child's safe return had, all along, been the place where she'd been hidden. Old members of the congregation couldn't comprehend it. Some said it was impossible that no one could have done something so vile under their noses. Others claimed they'd always felt something strange about that building, that certain rooms never felt right. Rumors began spreading again, this time more desperate than before. Who had sealed that crawl space? And why had no one noticed the changes all those years ago? Detectives reopened the cold case, pulling every box of evidence out of storage. They laid the old reports across tables, rereading witness statements, cross-referencing, maintenance logs, and property repair records. One pattern emerged almost immediately. The renovations done to the basement had taken place just a few weeks after the original search ended in 1990. The work had been authorized by the church's maintenance supervisor at the time. His name appeared over and over in those documents, Dale Mercer. He was now 70 years old, living quietly in a nearby county. He'd retired years earlier and rarely spoke to anyone. But when officers knocked on his door to inform him of the discovery, he appeared unsurprised, pale, but calm. He denied knowing anything about the crawlspace, said he'd simply patched what needed fixing back then. Still, investigators noted how his hands trembled when he signed the statement form. For the community, his name brought every buried suspicion roaring back to life. People who had defended him for years now whispered that they'd been wrong. Others still refused to believe it. The church, that had symbolized forgiveness, now stood behind police barriers, its windows boarded, its steeple casting long shadows across the road. Even as forensic teams continued working through the site, an unbearable irony hung over the town that for 28 years, people had gathered above that very floor, praying for Hannah's return. Week after week, they had sung hymns, shared communion, baptized children, all while her remains lay sealed beneath their feet. When investigators finally finished their work, the crawlspace was closed again, this time under official seal. The church was declared a permanent crime scene until the case reached resolution. But Maple Ridge didn't need the final report to understand what it meant. Faith had always been their answer to fear. Now it had become a reminder of what they missed, of how horror had lived quietly under their prayers, waiting to be found. And somewhere in that silence, one question began echoing louder than the rest. If Hannah had been hidden there all along, who had the keys? Every case we cover takes weeks of research, fact-checking, and sleepless nights because these stories matter, and someone still deserves to be remembered. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth, please like, subscribe, and share which moment hit you the hardest in the comments. Watch more of the most mysterious solved cold cases. The links are in the description below. Now, let's get back to the case. The DNA results came back in late autumn. By then, the investigation had already turned the small Tennessee town upside down again. It had been nearly 3 decades since Hannah Walker vanished from the church parking lot, and most people had learned to live with the not knowing. But now, that fragile peace was shattered. The lab results were conclusive. The remains found sealed in the basement belonged to Hannah. The news hit Maple Ridge like a second funeral. For the detectives handling the reopened case, it raised a more chilling question than before. Who had put her there? They started with the list everyone connected to the church in 1990. Former staff, volunteers, choir members, anyone with access to the building. Most had moved away or passed on. But one name, buried in the old files, kept returning like an echo: Dale Mercer. He was 70 now, living in a trailer on the outskirts of Franklin County, 2 counties over. A retired handyman, still quiet and withdrawn, the same way people remembered him. Detectives drove out one afternoon to find him sitting on the porch, a small dog sleeping at his feet. When told about the discovery, Mercer didn't react at first. He just nodded, like he'd been expecting this moment for years. They asked if he remembered anything about that Sunday. He said yes, the service, the cleanup, the drive home. He denied seeing Hannah, denied any knowledge of the crawlspace. His story hadn't changed since 1990. But, the detectives knew this time, things were different. The church was gone now, but the evidence it held was speaking louder than anyone's memory. The new case team began cross-referencing everything. The original logs from church maintenance, attendance rosters, and the volunteer schedule from the day Hannah disappeared. That's when they noticed something strange: a missing page from the janitorial logbook. It was dated the exact week of Hannah's disappearance. Mercer was the only one responsible for cleaning that Sunday, but no record of his hours existed. They dug deeper into archived bank records from the church and found payment receipts from a hardware store dated just 2 days after the abduction. The purchases included bags of concrete, lumber, and mortar mix materials that matched what had sealed the crawlspace. The account number on the receipt traced directly back to Dale Mercer. When confronted, Mercer told investigators those supplies were for a plumbing repair in the basement, something about a cracked wall near a drainage pipe. But there was no documentation of any plumbing work being requested or completed that year. The story felt rehearsed. The same calm tone. The same detachment. Then came a small but devastating detail from a former deacon, one that changed everything. He remembered Mercer always carried spare keys, not just one set, but multiples. He said Mercer was the kind of man who liked to fix things quietly, often working in the building long after everyone else had gone home. He even had access to areas no one else did, including the basement. Investigators returned to Mercer's home with a search warrant. They collected old toolboxes, paint buckets, and a stack of water-stained ledgers from his shed. Nothing immediate stood out until one detective found a tin box tucked behind an old photo album inside a cabinet. Inside was a collection of faded church flyers, attendance sheets, and a letter written, in shaky cursive on yellowed stationery. It was signed by someone named Clara Mercer, Dale's late wife, who had passed away in 2002. The note read, "I can't keep this secret anymore about that little girl. I wanted to tell someone, but I was too scared. I think God will punish me for what I've done by staying silent." The rest of the page was torn off. It wasn't a confession, not in the legal sense, but it was enough to make every investigator in that room pause. They tracked down Clara's sister, who still lived in the area. She said Clara had fallen ill years before her death, suffering from bouts of paranoia and guilt. She never spoke of specifics but had once mentioned that Dale kept something buried that shouldn't be. At the time, her family assumed she meant marital problems or money. Now, that phrase carried a different weight. Detectives built a timeline of the days after Hannah's disappearance. They learned Mercer had volunteered to inspect the church foundation after hearing about a damp smell in the basement. According to records, he was the only one with building access that week. He'd spent nearly 2 full days alone in that space under the pretense of doing repairs. No one questioned him. He was, after all, a trusted member of the congregation, the man who fixed the broken pews and changed light bulbs before services. That realization that he'd been right there among them, shaking hands and bowing his head in prayer, chilled everyone who had once defended him. When confronted again with these new findings, Mercer stayed composed. He didn't deny buying the materials or working alone, but he insisted he'd been framed by coincidence and memory. "You're digging up ghosts," he told them. "That church has enough of them already." He was released pending further evidence. But for the people of Maple Ridge, there was no question left. They believed they'd prayed beside a killer. The FBI's behavioral team re-examined the case, focusing on Mercer's psychological profile. He fit the pattern of someone who operated within familiar, controlled environments, someone whose crimes blended into his routine. He wouldn't have needed to plan extensively. His authority and access gave him all the cover he needed. As agents retraced every repair job and maintenance record Mercer ever filed, they began to notice small gaps, work requests that were never approved but marked completed in his handwriting. The church's basement, they discovered, wasn't the only place he'd sealed off. 2 other properties where he'd worked maintenance years later had similar makeshift repairs, sealed crawl spaces, bricked storage areas. Both were re-examined, though neither contained remains. Still, the pattern was too specific to ignore. Meanwhile, in Maple Ridge, old fears returned. Former members of the congregation struggled to reconcile the past with what they were learning. They remembered Mercer's quiet smile, his steady presence during services, the way he'd kneel near the altar during evening prayers. Many wondered how close they had come to evil without ever realizing it. The sheriff at the time of Hannah's disappearance, long retired, now told reporters he never believed the case was random. "We were looking for a monster in the dark," he said. "Turns out he was standing in the light the whole time." As the case file grew thicker with new evidence, a grand jury was assembled to determine whether Mercer could be charged. But the statute of limitations for certain offenses had passed, and without direct physical proof linking him to the act, prosecutors had to wait for one thing: a confession. For weeks, detectives visited him, trying to break through his calm exterior. Some believed guilt was eating at him. Others thought he was incapable of remorse. He continued to deny it all. Still, they had that letter. That single line from his wife's hand, trembling and incomplete. "I can't keep this secret anymore about that little girl." It wasn't enough to convict him, but it was enough to shatter whatever wall of silence had protected him for 28 years. And in the town of Maple Ridge, whispers of what might have happened beneath that church began spreading again. Parents who once told their children the story of Hannah Walker as a warning, now told it with a new, bitter ending. That sometimes, evil doesn't hide in the shadows at all. It sits beside you in the pew, holds your door open, and calls you neighbor. The truth was closing in, and the man who had built walls to bury the past was about to face what lay beneath them. After nearly 3 decades of silence, Dale Mercer finally broke. It happened in a gray interview room at the Franklin County Sheriff's Department, a space where hundreds of suspects had sat before him, but none who carried a secret this heavy or this old. For hours, detectives circled him with quiet persistence, showing him photographs, old church records, and the faded letter written by his late wife. He held his composure until they laid down the photo that ended at Hannah's small yellow shoe, the one found in the sealed crawl space. Something inside him shifted. His shoulders slumped. He asked for water. And then, after 28 years of denial, he began to talk. He told them it had been an accident. Said he'd been backing out of the church parking lot after cleaning up that Sunday when he saw a blur in his mirror, the flash of a yellow dress. He claimed he struck her without realizing how fast she'd darted behind the truck. When he got out, she wasn't moving. He panicked. Said no one was around, no one would understand, and he feared he'd go to prison for the rest of his life. He described wrapping her small body in a church blanket, carrying her down to the basement, and placing her inside a small space he'd once used to store paint and tools. He said he'd meant to tell someone, the pastor maybe, but fear won out. Later, he returned with bricks and mortar, sealing the wall himself. His story sounded rehearsed, like something he'd practiced alone for years, perfecting each pause. He spoke of guilt, of sleepless nights, of his wife finding out years later and begging him to confess. He said the secret had destroyed them both. For the detectives, it was something but not the whole truth. The forensic reports didn't line up with the story of panic. The injuries to Hannah's remains weren't consistent with a simple collision. There were signs of defensive trauma, indications that she had been alive for a short time after the impact. Fibers found in the crawl space matched the church's utility rope, suggesting she'd been restrained before being placed there. Investigators believed what Mercer described as an accident was anything but. They re-examined statements from people who'd known him in the 1980s and early 1990s. Neighbors remembered the man differently than how the church once painted him. Some recalled his fixation on obedient children, how he'd linger outside Sunday school rooms or bring candy to neighborhood kids. One woman said he'd offered to drive her daughter home after choir practice once, even though they lived just a few blocks away. She'd declined, uneasy with his smile. Another said he often spoke about how parents don't teach kids to respect adults anymore. Those recollections, buried in the back of people's minds for decades, now carried a sinister undertone. Mercer had always been trusted the man with the keys, the quiet caretaker who never missed a Sunday. But the more the detectives listened to him, the clearer it became that he wasn't describing a moment of panic. He was describing control. The prosecutor's office began preparing charges: manslaughter at minimum, possibly first degree, if intent could be proved. But even as the paperwork moved forward, Mercer's health began to decline. He was 71, diabetic, and showing signs of heart trouble. His doctors warned that stress could be fatal, but he refused to go to the hospital. One morning, just 2 weeks before the official indictment, officers found him collapsed on the floor of his trailer. He was gone before paramedics arrived. A single cup of coffee sat cold on the table beside an open Bible and an unfinished crossword puzzle. He'd taken the rest of the truth with him. For Hannah's family, the news didn't bring peace. Ellen Walker wept when she heard about his death, not from pity, but from exhaustion. After nearly 30 years, the man who'd stolen her daughter's life had escaped the one thing she wanted most: answers. Mark Walker said in an interview that it felt like a second robbery. He believed Mercer had never told the full story, because the full story was worse than anyone wanted to believe. In the weeks that followed, investigators combed through Mercer's property, searching for any remaining evidence: diaries, notes, or confessions. They found none. The church itself was condemned soon after. Engineers declared the structure unsafe. The decades of moisture, excavation, and decay had hollowed it from the inside. Before demolition, one last team conducted a final sweep of the basement. What they uncovered deepened the mystery. Buried in the soil near the old crawl space were additional fragments, not human, but small animal bones mixed with trinkets and marbles. It wasn't clear why they were there. Some speculated he'd used the space before, perhaps for ritual or compulsion. Others believed the bones were a way for him to practice concealment test runs for what would come later. Nothing could be proved, but the discovery left even seasoned investigators shaken. When the church was finally torn down, The Donzer demolition crew stopped for a moment before swinging the first wrecking ball. A handful of townspeople had gathered across the road, some who remembered the walkers, others who'd grown up hearing their story whispered as a warning. They watched in silence as the walls came down, layer by layer, until all that remained was the foundation and a hollow square of dirt. A memorial marker was placed at the site later that year. It read simply, "In memory of Hannah Walker, loved, found, and never forgotten." But for many in Maple Ridge, there was no real closure. Justice had stopped halfway, the truth unearthed but unfinished. The questions lingered in every conversation. Was it really an accident? Had there been others? And if Mercer had been capable of that kind of deception, what else had he done in those years before and after? Detectives privately admitted that even with his death, they never stopped feeling that something larger lay hidden in his past patterns that didn't end with one victim. Records showed he'd worked maintenance at 4 other churches across Tennessee during the 1980s and 1990s. 2 of those congregations reported minor break-ins and missing children's toys, events dismissed at the time as petty vandalism. Those reports were now being revisited. Still, there was no definitive proof linking him to anything beyond Hannah's case. The official conclusion remained what Mercer claimed: a tragic accident, followed by decades of cowardice. The sheriff who closed the file called it the most bitter form of closure imaginable. Ellen Walker kept one item from the evidence box, her daughter's plastic bracelet. She said it smelled faintly of dust and old wood, but it was the only piece that still felt real. She told a reporter, "People think closure means peace. It doesn't. It just means there's nothing left to chase." Years later, the lot where the church once stood grew over with wild grass and pine saplings. Locals said on quiet mornings, you could still hear the echo of the old church bell swinging in the wind, though no one had touched it since the building came down. For Maple Ridge, the case was over. For the Walkers, it never would be. And as the town moved on, one truth remained buried beneath all the theories and reports that for 28 years, the answers everyone prayed for had been hidden in the place they trusted most. The church was gone, the man responsible was dead, but the silence he left behind was louder than ever. 28 years after that Sunday morning that split their lives in two, the Walker family returned to Maple Ridge. It had taken them nearly a decade after the final investigation closed to find the strength to come back. The church was gone now, nothing left but the cracked concrete foundation, patches of wild grass, and a scatter of broken bricks half sunk into the dirt. The steeple that once reached over the concrete tree line had been torn down long ago. Its bell sold for scrap, its chime now only remembered by those who'd lived through that day. The air that morning was still. Even the cicadas seemed to fall silent as Ellen Walker stepped from her car. She was older now, her hair silver at the edges, her movements careful but deliberate. Mark walked a few paces behind her, holding a small bouquet of yellow daisies, Hannah's favorite flower. Their son, born years after the tragedy, stood quietly between them, eyes lowered. He'd grown up hearing the story secondhand, a story too heavy to fully understand but impossible to escape. At the center of the old church lot stood a single plaque, anchored into the ground where the altar used to be. The engraving was simple. In memory of Hannah Walker, she was found. She is home. Beneath it, someone no one was sure who had left a child's bracelet. Plastic beads faded but still threaded in the same loop as the one recovered from the crawl space. Around them, a few dozen locals gathered with candles and paper cups of coffee, their faces marked with the kind of quiet sadness that time never fully erases. Many of them had been there in 1990. They'd searched the woods, walked the creek beds, handed out flyers. Some had prayed for the family every Sunday since. For them, the ceremony wasn't just about closure. It was about finally acknowledging the truth that had haunted this ground for nearly 3 decades, that while they prayed above it, Hannah had been lying just below. The service began without music. The current pastor from a nearby congregation spoke a few words about truth, about how sometimes it takes a lifetime to surface. He said Hannah's case reminded them that faith wasn't about forgetting pain but facing it, that redemption, in its truest form, often comes long after justice fails. Ellen stood in silence, one hand resting on the plaque. Her eyes didn't move. Among the crowd was a man few people recognized, Detective Samuel Green, the investigator who had reopened the cold case back in 2005. He stood apart from the others, hands folded, expression unreadable. Later, when asked about that day, he said he remembered only the sound of the wind moving through the grass and the sight of Ellen touching the stone. It wasn't about luck, he told a local reporter. It was about persistence, about never letting the silence win. For Green, the case had defined his career. He'd spent years combing through old evidence, revisiting dead ends, re-interviewing witnesses who swore they had nothing left to say. When the discovery was made beneath the church, it wasn't triumph he felt, it was anger. Anger that she'd been there all along, that the answers had been buried in plain sight, in a place meant for salvation. The ceremony ended quietly. No speeches, no applause, just the sound of footsteps as people began to drift back to their cars. Ellen lingered a little longer. She knelt beside the plaque, placed the daisies on the ground, and whispered something no one could hear. Mark rested a hand on her shoulder. For the first time in nearly 30 years, there were no reporters, no questions, no sirens, just the sound of the breeze moving through the field where a church used to stand. As the crowd dispersed, the detective stayed behind, walking the perimeter of the old foundation. The grass had grown tall around the edges, but he could still trace where the basement stairs once began, where the crawl space had been sealed shut. He thought about how many times he'd read the name Hannah Walker in those yellowed reports, how often he'd imagined what she might have looked like as an adult. He said later that in that moment, the case didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a warning that evil doesn't always hide in the dark. Sometimes it hides behind familiarity, behind trust, behind prayer. By late afternoon, only the Walkers remained. They stood together one last time, staring at the empty space where the sanctuary once stood. Ellen took a photograph from her purse, the same school photo used on every missing person flyer. Hannah, age 5, smiling with her front tooth missing, the corner of her hair clipped just out of frame. Ellen placed the photo on the ground, the edges fluttering in the soft wind, then turned to leave. The sky above Maple Ridge dimmed to the color of ash. As they drove away, the old church lot fell quiet again. Evening light spilled through the trees, catching on the rough outline of the foundation, the only trace left of what once was. Later, the County Historical Society archived the case files, sealing them in a box labeled, Walker Investigation Closed, 1990-2005. But for those who'd lived through it, closure was a word that didn't quite fit. The town carried the memory like a scar, faded, but permanent. Some said the field still felt heavy at night, as if the ground itself remembered. Others swore that on quiet mornings, when the sun hit the foundation just right, the reflection from the stone plaque looked almost like a child's silhouette, standing there. The documentary voice of the detective, recorded years later, closed the story. You spend enough time in this line of work and you learn something about truth. It doesn't rot, and it doesn't disappear. It waits, sometimes for decades, sometimes under your own feet. The screen faded then, to Hannah's photograph, the same one from the flyers. Her smile frozen in time, the light in her eyes untouched by what came after. Slowly, the photo dissolved into an image of the church basement, sunlight leaking through broken boards, dust dancing in the air. The concrete walls were empty now, but in that silence, there was something else. Not peace exactly, but the faint, undeniable weight of truth finally brought to light. And that's where the story of Hannah Walker ended. Not with justice, not with revenge, but with the one thing her family had been denied for 28 long years, the truth.